She was supposed to be in bed by 10. Curfew, protocol, the invisible architecture of royal life that dictates where a future queen sleeps and when. Instead, on a warm June night in Madrid, Princess Leonor of Spain was standing in a crowd of thousands, swaying to a Bad Bunny song, her face lit by phone screens instead of palace chandeliers. No royal decree announced it. No press release explained it. She simply left, and for a few hours, she disappeared into the one place a future monarch is never supposed to be able to hide, a crowd of strangers who didn't care who she was. This is the story of why Princess Leonor keeps slipping out of the palace unannounced, and what it reveals about the quiet rebellion happening inside one of Europe's most rigid monarchies. If you've spent any time following Spanish royal coverage, you've probably seen the polished version of Leonor's life. The military graduations, the state dinners at Merivent Palace, the perfectly tailored blazers and the practiced wave. What you don't see, because it isn't supposed to be seen, is the other Leonor. The one who ditches the itinerary. The one whose security detail has apparently learned to expect the unexpected. And that's really the question worth sitting with for the next half hour. What does it mean when the heir to a 300-year-old throne keeps choosing, again and again, to step outside the frame she was born into? Let's start with what actually happened, because the tabloid version of this story tends to spiral into fantasy, and I promised you at the start of this channel that we don't do that here. In early June 2026, Leonor and her younger sister, Infanta Sofia, had just come off an intense stretch of formal royal duty. Pope Leo XIV was making his first visit to Spain, and the sisters had spent the weekend in strict black formal wear, standing beside their parents through ceremonial mass, a reception at Madrid City Hall, and the kind of choreographed public appearances that leave no room for spontaneity. Black dresses. No mantillas, a deliberate modern styling choice, but still every inch the image of institutional duty. 2 days of being watched, photographed, and measured against centuries of expectation. And then, that same weekend, something shifted. Spanish media reported that Leonor and Sofia turned up at a Bad Bunny concert. Not a state box. Not a roped-off VIP section announced in advance. They were there the way anyone else is there, dressed down, blending into a sea of concertgoers, trading the formality of the papal visit for the noise and sweat of a reggaeton show. It wasn't leaked by the palace. It wasn't part of any official calendar. It surfaced because people in the crowd recognized them and started talking. That's the detail that should stop you in your tracks. The heir to the Spanish throne was recognized by ordinary fans before she was ever confirmed by her own institution. The royal house didn't orchestrate this appearance. The public did the work of noticing it. This wasn't a one-off. Go back 2 months earlier, to April 4th, and you'll find a nearly identical pattern. Queen Letizia took her 2 daughters to see Rosalía, the Spanish singer whose Lux tour had just landed in Madrid for a 4-night residency. Again, no formal announcement. Again, the sighting came from fans in the crowd, this time captured by people sitting near the royal trio and passed along to a Spanish journalist. Letizia, Leonor, and Sofia arrived just minutes before the show started and left before the final song, timed almost like a covert operation. Slip in, watch the performance, slip out before the moment could calcify into a photo op. Leonor, by this point deep into her final stretch of military training, had apparently carved out time in an academy schedule that leaves almost no room for personal life, specifically to watch a concert with her mother and sister. And it goes back even further than that. In early March, the royal family quietly joined residents of the Carabanchel Bajo neighborhood in Madrid for the Procession of Silence, one of the most solemn events of Holy Week. No prior announcement. They arrived and blended into the crowd gathered outside the local parish, watching alongside ordinary families instead of observing from a reserved, elevated position. 3 separate incidents, 3 different contexts, one consistent thread, a family, and specifically a princess, who keeps choosing to step out of the palace's visibility architecture and into the anonymity of a crowd. Now, here's where I want to slow down, because this is exactly the kind of pattern that gets flattened into clickbait by channels that don't do their homework. The version of this story you'll find on low-effort content mills goes something like, Leonor secretly flees the palace to escape her family, or, Princess Leonor's midnight escape reveals royal crisis. That's not what the evidence supports, and I'm not going to manufacture drama that isn't there just because it would get more clicks in the short term. What the record actually shows is more interesting than a scandal, because it's not about escape. It's about negotiation. It's about a 20-year-old woman who has spent her entire adolescence inside one of the most controlled environments a young person can occupy, quietly testing where the boundaries of that control actually are. To understand why this matters, you have to understand just how controlled Leonor's environment really is. This is a young woman who was sent, at 16, to a boarding school on a remote stretch of the Welsh coast, a place chosen specifically because its cliffside isolation made it nearly impervious to paparazzi. From there, she moved directly into 3 years of military training, first at the General Military Academy in Zaragoza, then aboard the Juan Sebastián de Elcano for a naval training voyage, and finally through the General Academy of Air and Space, where she graduated this past July and received the Grand Cross of Aeronautical Merit from her own father. Royal sources have described the security protocol awaiting her at university this fall as being just as invisible, and just as strict, as anything she experienced before, drawing a direct comparison to how her father Felipe was shadowed by a bodyguard posing as a fellow classmate decades earlier, an arrangement so discreet it reportedly took him days to even realize what was happening. That's the baseline. That's the water Leonor has been swimming in since she was a teenager. Every environment engineered for containment. Every appearance calculated, cleared, and staged. So when you place the Bad Bunny concert, the Rosalía outing, and the Holy Week procession against that backdrop, they stop looking like isolated lapses in protocol and start looking like something closer to a pattern of quiet self-authorship. A young woman using the small windows available to her, a night off from academy duties, a gap in the official calendar, to decide for herself, even briefly, who she gets to be and where she gets to stand. There's a phrase that gets used a lot in coverage of Leonor, and it's worth sitting with for a second, because I think it explains a lot about what's happening here. Spanish commentators have said that even the smallest deviation from her usual routine sparks disproportionate discussion, precisely because her life appears to be scheduled down to the minute. Think about what that actually means for a 20-year-old. Somewhere in Spain right now, there are people her exact age choosing what university lecture to skip, what concert to go to on a random Tuesday, what to wear to it, without a single one of those choices being catalogued, analyzed, and turned into a headline. Leonor doesn't get that. Every choice she makes that falls outside the institutional script becomes evidence in a larger story about who she is and who she might become as queen. So when she chooses, repeatedly, to make choices that fall outside that script anyway, that's not nothing. That's a young woman metabolizing an extraordinary amount of pressure and finding small, deliberate ways to push back against the edges of it. This is where I think the emotional core of this story actually lives, and it's worth pausing here before we move forward. Because if you strip away the royal titles and the Guinness records and the military decorations, what you're left with is something almost universally recognizable. A young person who has spent her entire life being told exactly who she's supposed to be, using the few moments of freedom available to her to find out who she actually is. Most of us went through some version of that tension in our late teens and early 20s. Most of us didn't have 3 separate branches of the Spanish Armed Forces evaluating our every move while we did it. There's something worth sitting with in the fact that Leonor's version of teenage rebellion isn't running away or breaking the law. It's standing in a crowd at a concert. It's walking, unannounced, alongside neighbors during a religious procession. The stakes of what counts as acting out are calibrated entirely differently when you're the heir to a throne. Let's talk about the mechanics of how these outings actually happen, because that's where the real intrigue lives, and it's more interesting than any manufactured, secret plot, narrative could ever be. The Spanish royal household has become remarkably skilled at what security experts would call low-profile movement. This isn't Leonor slipping out a service entrance in a disguise, whatever the more sensational corners of the internet might imply. It's closer to a calculated absence of announcement. The palace simply doesn't confirm the outing in advance, doesn't provide official photography, and doesn't comment when asked. That silence does 2 things at once. It preserves a sliver of authentic private experience for Leonor, and it protects the institution from the appearance of endorsing behavior that falls outside strict royal decorum. The family gets to have the moment. The palace gets to maintain deniability about whether that moment was approved. It's a quiet, elegant compromise between a young woman's need for normalcy and an institution's need for control, and once you notice it, you start to see it everywhere in how modern European monarchies are adapting to survive. Because make no mistake, that's ultimately what this is about. Survival. The Spanish monarchy, like most of its European counterparts, exists today because it has proven itself capable of evolving. Leonor's own grandfather, Juan Carlos I, spent his final years in exile after a corruption scandal badly damaged public trust in the institution. Academic research out of the University of Murcia has tracked ongoing public sentiment toward the monarchy in the years since, and the throne Leonor is set to inherit is not one that can afford to feel remote, cold, or completely divorced from ordinary Spanish life. A future queen who is never seen enjoying a concert, never seen participating in a neighborhood tradition, never seen doing anything that resembles the life of the people she'll one day represent, is a queen at risk of feeling like a stranger to her own country. In that light, these small unauthorized appearances aren't liabilities. They might be exactly the kind of quiet, humanizing moments the monarchy actually needs in order to remain relevant to a generation that has grown increasingly skeptical of hereditary institutions altogether. There's also a sibling dimension to this story that I think deserves real attention, because Infanta Sofia is present in almost every one of these unannounced outings. She was there at the Rosalía concert. She was there at the Bad Bunny concert. The two sisters, who Spanish media routinely describe as striking lookalikes, seem to be building their own private language of escape together, a shared strategy for carving out normal experiences inside an abnormal life. That matters because Sofia doesn't carry the same institutional weight Leonor does. She's not the heir. Her presence at Leonor's side during these outings suggests something closer to sisterhood than strategy, two young women who understand exactly what the other is dealing with, choosing to disappear into ordinary life together rather than separately. If you're a longtime viewer of this channel, you'll know we've covered the Leonor-Sofia relationship before, and this pattern only reinforces what earlier reporting has suggested, that their bond may be one of the few genuinely unscripted relationships either of them gets to have. Let's widen the lens for a moment and place this within the broader arc of Leonor's public life, because context is everything here. This is a young woman who, at 18, already went through a viral moment of breaking protocol, when a cadet at her own graduation ceremony complimented her looks on camera and she responded not with practiced formality but with a real, unguarded smile. That moment sparked what Spanish media nicknamed Leonormania, a term used to describe the surge of public affection and curiosity that followed her into adulthood. Even then, journalists were already asking the exact question this video is built around: is Leonor's warmth and relatability simply natural, or is it the product of careful, deliberate cultivation by palace image makers preparing the perfect future monarch? 3 years later, with a fresh pattern of unannounced concert appearances and quiet procession attendance, that question feels more relevant than ever, and I'd argue the honest answer is that it's probably both. Institutions shape people, and people push back against the shape they're given. Leonor appears to be doing both at once, in real time, in front of an entire country. It's also worth noting how this pattern intersects with the much larger transition Leonor is currently navigating. As of this past summer, she completed her final stretch of military training, graduating from the General Academy of Air and Space on July 10, 2026, and receiving one of the Spanish military's highest honors directly from her father. That marks the formal close of a 3-year chapter defined almost entirely by discipline, hierarchy, and institutional structure. This coming September, she's set to begin studying political science at Carlos III University in Madrid, a shift from a fully regimented military environment into something closer, at least on paper, to ordinary student life. It's not a coincidence that these unannounced outings have clustered in the months right before that transition. You could read this entire pattern as a kind of rehearsal, a 20-year-old testing what it might feel like to move through the world with slightly more autonomy, right before she's expected to do exactly that on a university campus that will be watching her every bit as closely as the palace ever did. Because here's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. University isn't going to give Leonor the anonymity a typical incoming student gets. Reports on her upcoming enrollment have made clear that palace security is preparing an approach every bit as invisible, and every bit as rigorous, as what shadowed her father decades earlier at his own university. The difference now is the added layer of a smartphone-saturated world, where any student in any lecture hall can turn a routine hallway encounter into a viral moment within minutes. So even as Leonor steps into an environment that's supposed to resemble normal young adult life, the actual experience of that normalcy will likely remain just as manufactured, just as monitored, as everything that came before it. Which might be exactly why these small unauthorized concert appearances matter so much to her right now. They may be some of the last genuinely spontaneous moments she gets before an entirely new, and equally demanding, phase of public scrutiny begins. So where does that leave us? Not with a scandal. Not with a princess fleeing some dark secret inside the walls of Zarzuela Palace. What the evidence actually supports is something quieter and, honestly, more human. A young woman on the edge of adulthood, raised inside one of the most controlled and historically significant families in Europe, using the small cracks of freedom available to her, a concert here, a neighborhood tradition there, to define herself on her own terms before the next chapter of institutional expectation closes back around her. That's not a betrayal of the crown she's set to inherit. If anything, it might be exactly the kind of quiet, self-directed humanity that keeps a centuries-old monarchy feeling alive to the people it exists to represent. If this kind of grounded, fact-checked look into the real pressures shaping Europe's next generation of royals is the kind of content you come here for, make sure you're subscribed, because we're tracking Leonor's transition into university life closely over the coming months, and there is a lot more of this story still unfolding. Before you go, hit that like button if this changed the way you think about what royal duty actually costs a person behind closed doors. And if you're new here, welcome. This channel exists specifically because so much of what gets published about the Spanish royal family online right now is either recycled tabloid speculation or outright AI-generated fabrication. Every claim you just heard is grounded in verified reporting, and we're going to keep holding that line video after video. Because this isn't really the last time Leonor is going to test the boundary between duty and identity. It's going to happen again, at university, in ways that will be even harder for the palace to control, and even harder for her to navigate quietly. Next time, we're going deep into what her first semester at Carlos III University is actually going to look like, the security operation nobody is supposed to notice, and what happens the very first time a future queen tries to sit in a lecture hall like everybody else. You will not want to miss that one.